On 12th of August 2000, two signals came out of the Barents Sea. The second arrived about 135.76 seconds after the first, and it was vastly stronger. By the end of that day, the Russian nuclear-powered submarine K-141 Kursk, an Oscar II cruise missile attack submarine taking part in a major Northern Fleet exercise, was on the seabed. All 118 people aboard would die. What happened inside those final minutes has been argued over ever since. Officially, Kursk was lost after a defective exercise torpedo triggered internal explosions. Later, filmmaker Jean-Michel Carré pushed a far more dramatic alternative: a collision with the American submarine USS Toledo, then a torpedo strike by USS Memphis, followed by a joint US-Russian cover-up. To make sense of this, it helps to separate three different levels. First, established facts, things strongly supported by physical evidence or widely accepted records. Second, interpretations that fit the known data, even if they cannot be proved beyond doubt. And third, speculation, ideas that remain possible in some abstract sense, but lack decisive, verifiable proof. The established timeline is narrow but important. Late that morning, Kursk's crew was preparing a practice torpedo shot. At 11:28 Moscow time, the first event occurred in the forward part of the submarine. About 135.76 seconds later, a second and much larger event followed. After that, the boat was fatally damaged and sank. Seismology helps here, but only up to a point. NORSAR, the Norwegian Seismic Research Group, estimated the first signal at roughly magnitude 1.5 and the second at about 3.5. It also estimated an apparent source shift of around 145 meters to the northwest between the two events. That is enough to establish that there were two distinct events. It is not enough by itself to prove what triggered the first one. That limit matters, because people often ask too much of seismic data. The first signal was weak, close to background noise. The second was complex and did not match a neat textbook pattern for a simple open water blast. But that does not automatically point to an external attack. An explosion inside a large steel hull, followed by flooding and perhaps implosion effects, could also produce a messy signal. Seismology tells us there were two violent moments. It does not settle the whole story. The official explanation is that a leak of high-test peroxide, or HTP, in an older Type 65-76 exercise torpedo loaded in the fourth tube caused the first explosion. HTP is dangerous stuff. If it leaks and contacts the wrong materials, it can decompose violently, releasing heat, oxygen, and pressure. In the official chain of events, that first accident ignited a fire in the torpedo compartment. Then, a little over 2 minutes later, several stored torpedo warheads detonated together, destroying the bow and causing massive flooding. Among the competing explanations, this one has the strongest support in the available record. Investigators reported corrosion, bad seals, aging components, extended use of parts beyond ideal service life, weak documentation for armaments, inadequate crew training for handling HTP torpedoes, and broader negligence in maintenance and approval procedures. In other words, the official case was not just a torpedo blew up in isolation. It rested on a larger pattern of technical decay and organizational failure. Editorially, that matters because the HTP accident thesis explains several key points with the fewest extra assumptions. It accounts for the small first event. It accounts for a fire and a delay of about 2 minutes. And it accounts for the catastrophic second detonation. In this narration, that remains the strongest supported explanation. But that does not mean the official record is beyond criticism. The Russian response was confused and often damaging to trust. Search and rescue efforts started late. Public statements were contradictory. At times, officials themselves mentioned the possibility of a collision with a foreign submarine. Foreign assistance was initially rejected, and President Putin accepted outside help only on 17th of August. That delay shaped public suspicion, and not irrationally. We also know from Dmitry Kolesnikov's note that 23 men survived the initial explosions and made it to the 9th compartment. The note is one of the most haunting documents in modern naval history because it confirms that some of the crew lived on after the main disaster. How long rescue was realistically possible remains debated. Conditions in a flooded, damaged submarine on the seabed were terrible, and later, analysis does not produce a simple answer. What is certain is that help did not arrive in time. That certainty, combined with secrecy, opened the door to darker interpretations. Carré's argument gained attention partly because some of its narrower points are plausible. Western submarines were very likely monitoring a major Russian naval exercise in the Barents Sea. They may have operated closer than publicly admitted. A limited prior contact between vessels is not absolutely ruled out by the public seismic data. And because Russian transparency was incomplete, gaps remain. Those are fair cautions. They belong in the category of interpretations consistent with known data. But Carré's full thesis goes much further. It requires not only a close encounter, but a collision involving Toledo, then a deliberate or accidental torpedo strike by Memphis using a Mk-48, and then a successful cover-up involving both Moscow and Washington. That is a much heavier claim, and it needs correspondingly strong evidence. Publicly, that evidence has never appeared. There are no confirmed images showing characteristic collision damage on USS Toledo. There are no publicly confirmed foreign hull coating traces on Kursk. There is no released raw sonar record proving the sequence Carré proposed. There are no publicly verified repair records from the American boats establishing major hidden damage. And there is no publicly verified acoustic, fragmentary, logbook, or crew testimony demonstrating that a Mk-48 torpedo struck Kursk. The weak points in Carré's case become sharper when you look closely. One recurring claim points to USS Memphis being seen in Norway 6 days later. But Carré identifies Toledo as the submarine that supposedly collided with Kursk. That creates an attribution problem at the center of the story. Even if one American submarine appeared in port, that does not independently prove which boat did what, or that either boat attacked Kursk at all. Another famous point is the circular hole seen in the hull. This is often presented as if it were obvious torpedo evidence. In reality, it is weak. Kursk's recovery involved numerous cuts and openings, and the damaged hull went through a complex salvage process. Without a fully transparent chain of documentation and broader corroboration, that hole cannot bear the weight placed on it. And here we come to source criticism on the official side as well. One reason suspicions linger is that independent review was limited. The bow section was cut off and disposed of. There may well have been technical and safety reasons for that decision, especially given unexploded ordnance and the condition of the wreck. But the effect was still to reduce later independent examination of the very area where the first event occurred. Parts of that critical area were examined, yes, but much of the 133-volume investigation remained inaccessible, while the public largely received only a short summary. That is not ideal if you want lasting confidence. So where does that leave the central question? Torpedo accident, collision, or concealed attack? At the level of established fact, Kursk suffered 2 events separated by about 135.76 seconds, then sank with total loss of the crew. Some men survived the initial explosions for a time in the 9th compartment. Rescue failed to reach them in time. The state response was slow, contradictory, and secretive. At the level of best-supported interpretation, Kursk was destroyed by detonation of its own bow torpedoes. The most plausible trigger remains leakage of high-test peroxide in a Type 65-76 exercise torpedo, followed by fire, and then the second devastating explosion. This interpretation fits the timing, the scale difference between the 2 events, the reported technical shortcomings, and the wider pattern of poor maintenance, training, and leadership. At the level of unresolved possibility, a prior Western contact cannot be absolutely ruled out. Foreign submarines were likely nearby. Public data do not close every gap. But that is not the same as proof of collision, and it is very far from proof of a U.S. torpedo strike. And at the level of speculation lacking decisive proof, Carré's larger narrative remains unsubstantiated. The alleged Mk-48 attack and joint cover-up are dramatic, but direct, verifiable evidence for them has not been made public. In historical analysis, suspicion is not enough. Gaps in the record can justify caution, but they cannot automatically validate the most explosive theory. The tragedy of Kursk does not need embellishment. A powerful submarine went to sea in peacetime and was lost, very likely through a chain of technical danger, neglected maintenance, insufficient training, and failures of command and crisis response. That explanation is terrible enough, and it is also the one best supported by the available evidence. If you want more evidence-based deep dives, subscribe, enable notifications, and tell us the next topic to cover in the comments.